The current horrific predicament of Sri Lanka in riots, deaths, chronic shortages of critical products and fuel, intermittent power supply at best or no power supply at worst, falling incomes, collapsing enterprises, closed schools, debt default, a collapse in reserves, and now hyperinflation are some of the woes plaguing the Asian nation. What's even more horrific is the speed at which the country's economy has been declining, which is unusual even during times of conflict. Now, about a quarter of the population requires emergency humanitarian aid. Even in the next 6 months, the government will need at least $6 billion in aid from abroad. So why? What could be happening? Hello and welcome back to Econify. Today we'll take you through the crisis that seems to rock Sri Lanka and why it's happening. Do stay tuned and subscribe to our channel to get lots of amazing content. Let's fire away, folks. Basic commodity prices have doubled, tripled, quadrupled, and even kept growing in Sri Lanka, a tropical island nation just a few miles southeast of India. Even so that Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists who fought each other in the civil war just over a decade ago are now standing shoulder to shoulder in the streets to protest this and the 15-hour daily power outages. As supplies continue to diminish, the current situation with its 9 hours of electricity and excessively pricey groceries may soon be seen as the good old days. And yet, Sri Lankan specialists caution that this is only the beginning. United Nations officials have been sounding the alarm about a potential disaster in the developing world for the past month. Sri Lanka may just be the first domino to fall this year, and figuring out how it got there without enough money to buy even paper may give a hint as to what's to come. So how did Sri Lanka get like this? In 2019, Sri Lanka was able to acquire US dollars via a variety of additional means. 22% of its GDP came from tourist spending. In the same year, Lonely Planet named the country its top pick for travel. Why? Sri Lanka has got a lot of amazing natural scenery, yoga retreats, wild leopards, and gorgeous beaches. Remittances also constituted yet another channel through which foreign currency was obtained. The idea was that people would work abroad and send money home to their loved ones. Well, it's not so hard to imagine what happened in 2020 though. Overnight, tourism hit rock bottom. Tourist numbers had already been falling before the virus hit. Even worse was when terrorists struck the capital city of Colombo in the spring of 2019 with a series of bombings targeting churches and hotels. Due to the tragic and horrific loss of over 269 lives, the number of visitors dropped by 70%. While a drop of 2019's $7.9 billion to 2021's $1.6 billion in foreign reserves is poor news in and of itself, there's one additional factor that makes the situation more worse. Some currencies are said to be under or overvalued on purpose by certain governments. This category includes Sri Lanka. So, if the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Sri Lankan rupee is currently at 200 to 1, it would cost $1 to import a bag of rice from India. If Sri Lanka succeeds in convincing the world that the dollar is actually worth 150 rupees, then the price of rice will only drop by 25%. The central bank overvalued the rupee because imports were so crucial to the economy. Now, normally, authorities and the developing world maintaining economic and, by extension, political stability by keeping prices low on essential products. Why doesn't every country do this? Because of what Sri Lanka is experiencing right now. So maintaining an artificial exchange rate requires buying and selling foreign currency, and Sri Lanka is running out of that. When everyone else had already decided that, for example, 250 rupees was equal to $1, the government continued to insist that the exchange rate remained at 150. Look at it this way, if you go to a bank and give them $1, they will give you back 150 rupees. If, on the other hand, you were to take that same $1 bill into a private business, they might offer you as much as 200 back. Looking at that, it's pretty easy for that to spread, not only in Sri Lanka, but outside too. So, migrant workers rapidly learned that it is best to avoid using formal channels when sending money home. This makes it that much harder for the central bank to maintain its artificial exchange rate, as it now has even less foreign money on hand, and now things are going to become ugly and fast. What is Sri Lanka facing now? What Sri Lanka is going through right now is the result of 3 related issues. At the outset, the shortage of foreign currency means that the country cannot import enough goods to meet rising consumer demand. Now, what this means is that there isn't enough of anything to go around, be it rice, paper, fuel, or even anything. Also, overnight, the value of people's savings has dropped significantly from the day before. That's pretty sad. Imagine lost years of progress in a single night. And finally, the value of the rupee is falling rapidly and no one can predict when it will stabilize. Not even a genius could fail to notice this pattern. Every folk in Sri Lanka then begins hoarding necessities, groceries, fuel, and other essentials, creating widespread anarchy, confusion, and a permanent shortage. Ukraine was already precariously poised due to the pandemic and inadequate leadership, and the outbreak of war only made matters worse. The war and the sanctions that followed it have created the greatest drop in commodity prices in half a century. To give just one example, you can easily see the price and, more crucially, the volatility of wheat and maize produced in Russia and Ukraine. Until recently, Ukrainian exports alone provided enough food to sustain 400 million people around the world, and both Russia and Ukraine supply a significant portion of the wheat consumed in some nations. Russia also provides 15% of the world's fertilizer and the fuel used to produce it. Oil prices are through the roof, which is basically old news to everyone who drives a car and lives on Earth. As a result, several nations have banned or will soon restrict food exports, making an already difficult position even worse for countries like Sri Lanka that are net importers. So, bailouts for Sri Lanka? The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank normally often step in to help. In 2016, Sri Lanka received a $1.6 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Yet things are pretty much different now. Why is that? There are conditions attached to bailouts, such as functioning government and the adoption of unpopular economic policies, and there is more to it than a gut feeling for the IMF to issue loans. The IMF is very concerned that the country won't be in the same position in another 6 months. The unfortunate truth of all this is that political turmoil and social unrest will likely only discourage foreign assistance, even though citizens have every right to be angry at their government. It's true that the country's economic problems didn't appear out of thin air, as the protesters have claimed. The current crisis has its roots in decades ago, when Sri Lanka began replacing old loans with new ones, a practice the World Bank has likened to a pyramid scheme. It's easy to blame Chinese loans for the global economic collapse that followed the unprecedented global pandemic, but neither explanation is wholly accurate. China holds only a minority, 10%, of Sri Lanka's debt, and the country's leaders have pursued unsuccessful policies for years. Because when it needed public revenue the most, before any of the recent events in 2019, it cut taxes. Sri Lanka's external debt has also exploded. By late 2020, credit ratings agencies had already demoted Sri Lanka to near default status, effectively cutting it off from international funding markets. The government had previously refused to participate in a debt restructuring scheme or accept assistance from the IMF. Sri Lanka, however, kept paying its sovereign bondholders out of its foreign reserves, even after it was cut off from international capital markets, finally paying off a $500 million bond in early 2022. Businessmen with government ties allegedly reaped a 300 to 400% return on their investment thanks to the interest payments from these government-issued international sovereign bonds, despite the fact that the bonds were sold to them at a 50% discount. Not only Sri Lanka's poor leadership is surprising, rather the speed at which everything just fell apart in a few short weeks. The lives of millions of Sri Lankans who had previously enjoyed at least a comfortable middle-class life complete with cars, higher education, and leisure time are now pretty much bleak at best. It's a classic example of how nations can quickly get out of hand. For developing nations, repaying loans can be challenging because doing so means making a choice between spending scarce resources on domestic affairs and repaying the debt. It is estimated that the war will reduce global GDP growth by 1% worldwide this year. Any one of three things, a worldwide epidemic, a shift in interest rates, or the largest armed conflict in Europe since the Cold War, would have enormous implications. But all three at once? That's an awful scenario. We've got to the end of this video, guys. Feel free to drop your comments below. We'd love that. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Econify to get a lot of amazing content too.